Hello there, lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and today it is finally time to review both Bayonetta and Bayonetta 2 on the Nintendo Switch. Yes, we're going to be combining both reviews into one video because we love you that much. Both of these reviews were originally written by Dom Reese Lincoln and have been adapted for video by me. But anyway, that's more than enough waffling, let's dive right into things. With Bayonetta 3 teased as a Nintendo Switch exclusive, it's finally time for the sassy Umbra Witch to cartwheel a flurry of bullets onto the hybrid handheld hardware in anticipation. Much like Bayonetta 2, the original installment of the action-adventure series has been retooled for the Switch, and whilst this isn't the first time the franchise has been ported to a Ninty machine, both featured on the Wii U back in 2014, you're getting the very best version of the game yet, as to be expected. Well, you could technically argue that the PC version runs a little bit smoother and looks that little bit glossier, but regardless of the specs purring away in your tower, Bayonetta looks, feels, and is perfectly suited to the Switch's compact yet versatile platform. The Wii U port was serviceable and it ran pretty well, but was prone to some muddy textures and painful amounts of slowdown in certain specific areas. Thankfully, those issues have been resolved and the game runs so smoothly, you'd be fooled into thinking you were playing it on the original platform that it was intended. Before we get too deep into the changes, let's break down what makes Bayonetta such a timeless classic and, more importantly, why you should be dusting off those giant angel-slaying pistols on the Nintendo Switch. As the spiritual successor to the Devil May Cry series, Bayonetta is an ultra-violent romp crossed with the world's most acrobatic hair-related interpretive dance class. With guns in each hand and strapped to each high heel, the titular witch uses magic melee attacks and an endless stream of bullets as she carves a path into the palatial streets of heaven and the blackened caverns of hell. Many see this as developer Platinum Games' magnus opus, and it's easy to see why. The sheer depth at hand when it comes to combos is still astounding for a game that originally came out in 2009. With a vast and wonderful diverse series of enemies and bosses, knowing how to apply these moves and which ones work better strung together turns every battle into a blood-drenched puzzle. You can of course dial things down to easy or very easy mode, but the surprisingly challenging normal difficulty and beyond is where the game's true heart lies. It's a challenging game and one that will reap chunks of health from you should you mistime a dodge or commit too heavily to the wrong combo, but it is a fair one. Whilst the sequel ultimately made that formula a little bit more forgiving, the extra bite in the original makes it something truly special. From its gloriously grand boss fights to a steady flow of game-changing mechanics, it's a game that consistently surprises and effortlessly empowers. It should be said that the titular witch isn't the most politically correct of characters, especially in the more self-aware age we live in today. Whether you see her as a strong and confident female character that fights her own battles and takes no nonsense from anyone, even the giant bosses, or as an overly sexualized caricature, more akin to a teenage boy's ultimate fantasy, she's still one of the most memorable heroines of the last decade. And from my own point of view, it's so ludicrously over the top that you can't really take it seriously. Ultimately, Bayonetta is a mature game aimed at a mature audience. Then again, the buckets of blood and endless violence might have also been a clue. But anyway, let's get back to what's new and what's different. As we mentioned earlier, the Switch version of Bayonetta runs far smoother than the 2014 Wii U port. With more powerful guts at its disposal, you're treated to a more consistent frame rate and minimal screen tearing. The camera is still a little bit clunky at times, especially when things get particularly heated, but it's something that you simply adapt to the more you play. QuickTime events, sadly, are still a thing in this version of the game, and they're as unfair and utterly redundant as they were back in 2009. Thankfully, this is still forgiving with its checkpointing, and the ludicrously quick load times means you won't be hanging around very long at all. In the Wii U version, the single-touch setup of the gamepad made controlling something as fast-paced as Bayonetta a consistent exercise in frustration. The system's capacitive display allows for more precise movements, so moving Bayonetta around the screen in handheld is an absolute breeze, as is swiping back to evade or pressing down on an enemy to automatically attack. More complicated moves don't fully translate to the touchscreen, so it's not 100% of the experience, but we do have to take our hats off to the devs for making this an option. For those with less experience or limited movement, this is definitely an option worth considering. After nearly a decade, Bayonetta is starting to show her age, but that doesn't stop this hyperactive melee shooter action mashup from being one of the most rewarding and memorable cult hits of the previous generation. Retooled for Nintendo Switch, one of Platinum Games' most accomplished titles feels revitalized in both handheld and tabletop modes, serving up a meaty first course in the witchy buffet to come. But that's enough of the first entry, let's have a look at the second. Whilst the Wii U has ultimately become little more than a benchmark for the Nintendo Switch sales to surpass, the experimental pit stop between Wii and Nintendo's hybrid system still had a number of really must-have games. Bayonetta 2 sits proudly at the very top of that list, and now the bold and brazen action-adventure breaks the chains of exclusivity as it hits the Nintendo Switch with a triple somersault, a hail of bullets, and an ocean of angelic blood. Much like its predecessor, Bayonetta 2 takes the beating heart of its gameplay, namely over-the-top combos that combine magically powered melee attacks with deliciously brutal gunplay, and layers it into a game that's even more insane than the original. The story, which follows the antics of the titular witch and her continuing run-ins with the bestial powers of heaven, or Paradiso as it's known in the Bayonetta lore, as she hunts for the true gates of hell, is just as inexplicable and downright ridiculous, but that's part of the enduring charm. It doesn't matter if its plot makes no cohesive sense, because you're having so much fun killing godlike bosses. That Devil May Cry formula remains mostly unchanged from the original, but the free-flowing nature empowers you at every turn. Leaping away from enemy attacks, which are now slightly easier to predict, initiates that familiar burst of slow-mo known as witch time. Not to mention those button-mashing modifiers such as torture attacks also keep their rightful place. It also introduces the Umbra and Climax move, which is far better at clearing out a vast array of enemies rather than just a single one. But most importantly of all, those horrible quick-time events have finally been dropped. Bayonetta 2 is also a far more inclusive and rewarding experience than its forebearer, but it's a double-ended blade that leaves its mark, for better or for worse. There's no point beating around the bush, the second game is easier than the first. The window to dodge attacks is slightly larger, and the ability to interrupt enemy attacks occurs far more often. To its detriment, it does take the bite and challenge out of battles and boss encounters that makes this series so utterly bewitching, but much like the Wii U version, it's an issue that can be easily negated by simply dialing up the difficulty. At this time, hard mode is available from the start. Visually, Bayonetta 2 is one of the best looking games you can play on Switch right now. It's much like the original Bayonetta, but free of those older and muddier textures that plagued the original so much. The visuals and performance are so silky smooth that not once did I personally come across a single instance of slowdown, which is no mean feat. There's also an invigorating sense of diversity, especially for a game based so firmly around the free-flowing combat and its core design. You'll get to fight giant angelic dragons whilst riding inside a typhoon filled with disintegrating buildings just as a starter. You'll sprout your hair-powered wings and fight a giant demon King Kong style around a skyscraper in just the opening act. If Bayonetta was the game where Platinum Games nailed the formula that took the baton from Devil May Cry, Bayonetta 2 is the game where it embraces the opulent and endlessly satisfying set pieces that make this such a must-play experience. Thankfully, the mostly pointless angel attack minigame from the original has been dropped, and in its place we get Muspelheim. Muspelheim. A dark realm accessible by portals scattered across the world of Noaton that you'll be exploring, and other slightly more demonic regions. There were a few instances of these kind of challenges in the original Bayonetta, but they are far more prevalent in the sequel, and all the better for it. And more importantly, you'll be rewarded for your efforts with broken moon pearls and broken witch hearts, allowing you to extend your health and your magic respectively. Actually, no, it's the other way round. And then there's the brilliant tag climax mode, which allows you and a friend to fight waves of angelic enemies and bosses. And this time, both online and local play is supported, providing you have multiple copies of the game and multiple Switch consoles. You bet Halos, which is the currency at the start of the game, and the more that you bet, the harder the game becomes. It straddles that line between competitive and cooperative beautifully, as you're obviously trying to get a bigger slice of the pie, but also you want your teammates' support to make sure that you survive the onslaught. In just the same way as the original, Bayonetta 2's touchscreen support allows far more dexterous and responsive controls thanks to Nintendo's new hardware. Of course, we do still run into the issue of just how overly sexualized Bayonetta is as a character, but it has been slightly toned down in this sequel. It by no means changes Bayonetta as a character, but it does feel slightly more mature in a kind of ironic way. It feels just self-aware enough to know how ridiculous it is to be able to be tongue-in-cheek about it. Despite being a port of a 3-year-old game, Bayonetta 2 shines brightest on Switch. It runs seamlessly at 60 frames a second, looks incredible in both modes, and offers an addictive, free-flowing combat formula with a sprinkling of platforming, light exploration, and ridiculous story to create something that you simply need to play. If you've never played it before, you're in for a serious treat, and if you have already played it, you know you need to play it again.